Okay, we'll now take questions. I'll start on my right and scan this way. Please keep your hand up until I acknowledge you.
Well, this is a question for Seitz. More about your opening remarks than any of the stuff in the body of the paper. So we have the text. We have the text from Isaiah, "My ways are not your ways," but of course we have in Genesis, in his image and likeness. He created man in his image and likeness, and that's often been taken by philosophers and theologians in the Middle Ages to mean that the natural human reason, being a copy of God's reason, is capable of penetrating a great way into the nature of God. I believe that Karl Barth said somewhere that that's just where he parted company with the Catholic tradition. I was wondering if your emphasis on my ways are not your ways led you to part company with Aquinas and such people.
I thought about that first sentence, which is different in my oral delivery than in my paper. I think I tried to think quite carefully about the way I phrased that, and that is, I meant quite strictly, I would struggle with what it means to justify God. And I meant it quite literally. I don't mean, but I would contrast that with speaking right about God, with what God says to Job. You have spoken of me, nakuna, what is right. I think it's the obligation of Jew and Christian and believer to speak right about God. And I think Barth did too. So maybe the issue, maybe that's not your question, but that's where I was starting, that I would make a distinction between feeling as though God can be justified in some way. Strictly speaking, I don't think God can be justified. I think he can be spoken about rightly within limits and in the context of the community of faith and in witness to the world. But I don't think he can be justified. I think that's all I meant, and I meant that in a kind of low-flying way. I didn't mean to enter into the debate between Aquinas and Karl Barth at that point. Although there is, as you know, a huge sort of discussion there to be had about the character of natural law, the doctrine of creation, the way in which God has made us to fitted to talk properly about him.
Saying as you did that you're not interested in justifying the ways of God, and in fact that God can't be justified, gets you off the hook in a way with respect to addressing the challenges raised by the atheists. But you say things at the end of your paper that I think allow them to press the challenge. So you say, apparently citing with approval, you say, Origen speaks of the commands of God through Moses as unlike anything ever commanded to humanity, to which I imagine them saying, yeah. And as such, instantly transformative and a witness to his character as the true and only God, to which I expect them to say, that's our point. It is a witness to his character. You say his character is that of a loving and merciful God, but we look at these commands, and those commands, as you say here, are a witness to his character, and it's horrifying. You say, goodness is understood only from within the context of a life lived in relationship, to which I imagine them saying, yes, and look at the relationship of the Amalekites to this God. How are they to understand the goodness of God? So it seems that they, well, and you also say, well, I'm going on too long. So it seems that the question can be pressed, and so I'm curious what you say when the question is pressed that way.
I'm not sure. Is this your question about your question, or is it a question on behalf of other people? I'm just not sure. I don't mean that to be tricky. I just want to be clear. I know what I'm trying to answer. In respect of Origen, if you read the passage, Origen, who's quite familiar with laws, this is in his dialogue with Celsus. The basic point I think he's trying to make there is that in observing the natural world's efforts to describe law and to think through how morality is enforced civilly. He's read all the law codes he can find, and what he's trying to say is that when he comes to Moses, he sees law of an entirely different character. And Origen as you may know, is a very complex character on these things. On the one hand, he's actually quite a literalist. He prefers the literal in such measure that it will drive him to the allegorical. I mean, there's a sort of side of him in that. I think my only point there is that Origen has come to the knowledge of God and of what morality looks like in the Old Testament and in the New, having surveyed laws in general, and feels as though he's being grasped here in some different kind of way. Is that something that can be commended in general terms and win assent? I don't think so. I mean, myself, but I'm more on the Kierkegaard side of this matter, I suspect, than the Kantian one. And so I'm kind of a little hesitant to try to find a way to persuade non-believers that God is good and ought to be trusted. I'm not sure how that works. I suspect God undertakes a transaction in the human heart. But I'm on the side of Bart, I suppose. I don't know how people are persuaded that God is to be trusted. I genuinely don't, although I do have a strong personal feeling that when the loss of trust in God happens, I don't think it's a rational matter. I don't think it's just one day one read the Bible and said, boy, God's a baddie. I think something else breaks, and then God's a baddie. That's my pastoral side. I don't understand apologetics. And on that, I am a little more probably like Bart or Tertullian or somebody. If it's difficult, it may be, in fact, commendatory. That's all I was trying to get at with Origen.
Eleanor Stump.
I want to say that I found the last part of Evan Fales' remarks quite moving also, and in the circumstances, very generous. And I want to say that I'm also moved by his remarks in the comments in general. I guess it seems to me like this: if you rely on mystery, then it can be the case that what you say to yourself, to others, is that the God you worship is a je ne sais quoi. And that doesn't seem like a good idea at all. So it does seem to me that it's important to understand that the nature of the God at issue here is good. And for that, you do have to find some way of looking at these stories that is compatible with an understanding of goodness. Because if it turns out that God's goodness is not the same as our goodness, in fact has nothing in common with it, then we're back to the first point. You worship a je ne sais quoi because God's goodness got nothing in common with what we ordinarily mean by goodness. And in that case, people do well to worry about worshipers of God. And I also think we can get way too sophisticated about these stories. I have a lot of sympathy with Evan's worries about the way these stories are read. Here's the simple way the stories are being read. These Canaanites are bad and worthy of death, and they're a threat to the Israelites. And that's why the Israelites have to kill them all. So here's a question. On that simple reading of the story, which I don't accept at all, but on that simple reading of the story, here's a question. Why wouldn't God promise Abraham some land God knew was going to be uninhabited 400 years down the line? We don't have overpopulation at this period. There must be a lot of uninhabited land, even good uninhabited land. Why not take the Israelites there? Then nobody will be a snare to them. And if the Canaanites are worthy of capital punishment, why not do what all decent people would do? If you got to use capital punishment, put them to death painlessly and do it yourself. I mean, to me, it seems that there is a lot of point in Evan's worry about the way these stories are being read. I don't think they make narrative sense read that way. So I want to sympathize also with something Louise Anthony said earlier. I mean, when she said,
I'm
look,
sorry, can we...
Okay, last point.
What about 5 points
point.
in there, Eleanor?
Okay, all right, but just narratives have to make a kind of sense. You can't get too complicated about reading narratives either. They got to make sense, and I don't think this reading makes sense.
Do you want a response? Let me try, okay? I heard Evan's final comment actually rather different than you. I heard it as signaling that in the heart of faith, there is something like a mystery about why people stay in relationship with God. That's kind of what I heard. Now that struck me as a little different than what he was saying earlier, and he can speak to that. But as to your first point, you'll notice that this conference has no papers on the extreme goodness of God. In the nature of this conference's setup, we're meant to find heinous things, as it were, and try to find a way to justify them, all right? Now, no one needed to do that, but that's where everybody's gravitated. We got a bad part of the Bible. It's the old and the new may get better. Hopefully, it's hard to say. But the point is that we could have, presumably, we could have a conference when what we tried to do was talk about the way God's mercy and forgiveness breaks open hearts and gives new life. We could do that. And that's the kind of goodness that I think runs through the world and can be recognized as such, if that's the point of contact you're describing. I have no trouble with that at all. As a matter of fact, I'd like to believe that the good we would find is a greater good than we could ask for or imagine. But to do that, we'd have to turn to parts of the Bible that break our hearts open and remind us how much God loves us. This conference hasn't been designed to do that. I'd be happy to do it. Maybe I made a mistake, but I did what other people did. I tried to go to difficult parts and see how they were woven up in the heart of God. So continuity with the good that good people know, absolutely. I see it all over the pages of the Bible. But I didn't feel my assignment was to ramp that up, and I don't think I'd be any good at that anyway.
Gentleman about 3 rows back.
Might I ramp it up? I just did want to say, I was raised on the Sermon on the Mount. And for me, it really is the sort of focal point of the message of the goodness of God. I actually think it is rather revolutionary. You pointed out the passage of it doesn't. Jesus doesn't say that he has come to tell people to obey every jot and tittle of the law. He says he has come to fulfill every jot and tittle of the law, and that has to, I think. One has to pay some careful attention to what exactly that phrasing, what exactly it might mean.
My reference was actually just to clarify to anyone who teaches to relax one of these, it would be worse if a millstone was handed over. That's just to clarify. You're absolutely right, and that has to be heard in relationship to Christ's own fulfillment. I agree.
Yeah. I mean, many of the teachings on the Sermon on the Mount are at least sufficiently unobvious that Christians do seem to spend a good deal of effort either ignoring them or finding ways to circumvent them. You are never to swear an oath. You are not to pray in public. You are not to resist evil. And you are to sell your worldly possessions and give everything to the poor and take no care for the morrow. Those are very stringent, and I guess things would become quite revolutionary if everybody who was a Christian decided to fulfill all of those taken more or less at face value.